In medicine, every symptom should have an answer. Every cause should lead to an effect. But the case I am about to share with you defied every rule, every textbook, every truth I thought I knew. Years later, I still lie awake at night replaying it in my mind, and I can tell you this with certainty. Some mysteries are not meant to be solved. I have worked as a neurologist for many years. In that time, I've seen the brain at its most fragile and its most resilient. I've witnessed miracles of recovery and the cruel inevitability of decline. Patients with strokes, seizures, trauma, tumors. Each case has taught me something about the organ we call the mind. But there is one case that still stands apart from all the others. Not because it was tragic, though it was. Not because it was unusual, though it certainly was. But because even now, after countless hours of study and reflection, I cannot explain what happened. It began like any other night in the ICU. The fluorescent lights, the endless alarms, the quiet footsteps of nurses making their rounds. I was tired but alert, reviewing charts when they wheeled him in. A man whose seizures had already baffled the emergency team. I didn't know it then, but that night would change me. It would shake the very foundation of my profession. This is not a story about medicine. It is not a story about science. It is a story about what lies just beyond our reach, about the shadows that linger between consciousness and oblivion. And it is a story that, no matter how many years pass, still haunts me. I have spent most of my life surrounded by the sound of heart monitors, the sterile smell of antiseptic, and the quiet, heavy air of hospital corridors that never really sleep. Neurology is not a field for the faint-hearted. It is a discipline of precision, of cold data, of machines that map out the invisible storms inside the human brain. In this world, every symptom has a cause, every seizure an explanation, and every disorder an origin buried deep in neural tissue. At least, that is what I believed for the first 20 years of my career. I had seen countless patients, stroke victims, epileptics, those ravaged by dementia. I had looked into the eyes of families waiting for me to translate incomprehensible medical jargon into simple hope. I had prided myself on being steady, rational, and untouchable by the chaos of human fear. I thought nothing could surprise me anymore. But there was one case, one single patient, that shattered the foundation of my beliefs. To this day, even as I sit here, older, weary, and perhaps a little broken, that memory lingers like an infection in my mind. It is the reason I no longer laugh when colleagues dismiss unexplained cases as mere anomalies. It is the reason I sometimes wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, afraid to look into the dark corner of my bedroom. The story I am about to tell you is not one I have ever shared in detail with my peers. To speak of it in a medical conference would have destroyed my reputation. To write it in a journal would have been an act of professional suicide. But silence has not freed me from it. Silence has only allowed the memory to fester, whispering in the back of my mind like an unfinished sentence. You might wonder why I choose to share it now. Perhaps it is age. I no longer fear the judgment of my peers as much as I fear the thing that followed me after that case. Or perhaps I am simply tired of carrying it alone. All I know is this: what I encountered was not a puzzle to be solved by science, nor a symptom to be catalogued in a medical textbook. What I encountered was something far older, far darker, and far beyond the scope of medicine. It began, as many things do, on a night shift. The neurology ward was quiet, save for the soft beeping of monitors and the occasional shuffle of nurses making their rounds. I was in my office, reviewing a stack of EEG reports, when the call came in. A middle-aged man had been rushed into the emergency room after a violent seizure that lasted over 10 minutes. Paramedics reported that he had collapsed at home, thrashing so violently it took 2 men to restrain him. His vitals were stable now, but his eyes, they said his eyes looked wrong. I had heard such descriptions before. To the untrained eye, a seizure can look like possession, body twisting unnaturally, eyes rolling back, guttural sounds escaping a clenched throat. But I had seen it all before, and I knew better. Or so I thought. When I stepped into the patient's room for the first time, I immediately felt something shift in the air. It wasn't anything tangible. No change in temperature, no flickering of the lights, but a heaviness pressed down on me, as if the room itself resented my presence. The patient lay on the bed, pale and sweating, his chest rising and falling in quick, shallow breaths. His eyes opened just as I approached, and then something happened that has never happened to me before or since. He spoke my name, not doctor, not seer, but my full name, softly, deliberately, as though he had been waiting for me. I froze. I had never met this man before. No introductions had been made. The nurses looked at me, confused, assuming perhaps we knew each other. But I had never seen him in my life. That was the moment my rational world began to crack. Of course, I told myself it was coincidence. Maybe he had overheard my name. Maybe in his confused, post-seizure state, he had repeated it without knowing why. I clung to those explanations because the alternative, that a complete stranger knew me before I ever touched his chart, was unbearable. But deep down, some part of me already knew. This was not going to be an ordinary case. And I was right. This man, this patient, would become the most unexplained case of my career. He would strip away my faith in science, plague my dreams, and leave me with questions that will never be answered. Even now, as I write these words, I can hear the faint echo of his voice whispering my name in the quiet of this empty room. This story is not for the faint of heart. It is not a tale of miracles or healing. It is a descent into a darkness that science cannot chart and reason cannot escape. This is the story that still haunts me. Hospitals have a peculiar rhythm at night, one that those who have never worked in medicine can scarcely understand. The day is filled with noise. Doctors rushing through rounds, families crowding hallways, phones ringing endlessly. But when darkness falls, the hospital transforms. The footsteps soften, conversations fade, and the long corridors stretch into silence. The walls, once vibrating with life, become hollow and oppressive. You can hear everything at night, the faint buzz of fluorescent lights, the hum of machines keeping vigil over fragile lives, the cough of a patient echoing from far down the hall. It is not silence, not really, but a suffocating quietness layered with tiny sounds that never let you forget you are in a place where death lingers just beyond the walls. I used to enjoy those nights. Strange as it may sound, there was a kind of peace in them. Fewer distractions, fewer interruptions. A doctor could think. A doctor could study a patient's case without the constant demand for immediate answers. And neurology, more than any field, requires thinking, pattern recognition, logic, the slow unraveling of mysteries hidden in the folds of the brain. But that night, the peace was different. It was fragile, shattered easily. After meeting the new patient, the man who had somehow spoken my name before I introduced myself, I tried to immerse myself in routine. His initial tests were being processed, so I returned to my office to review reports from other cases. The desk lamp glowed softly against the stack of EEG printouts. I told myself it was just another patient. A seizure. A name uttered by chance, nothing more. And yet, my hands would not stop trembling as I turned the pages. I poured myself a coffee from the machine in the corner, hoping the bitterness would ground me. Instead, I found myself staring at the clock on the wall, 2:13 a.m., the dead hour of the hospital, when even the most restless visitors have gone home and the nurses fight the pull of sleep with black coffee and whispered conversations. Something about the hospital at that hour feels vulnerable, as if the building itself exhales and lets its guard down. I remember stepping out into the corridor just to clear my head. The hallway stretched long and empty, lined with doors leading into rooms where fragile human lives were suspended between survival and surrender. The floor gleamed under the dim lights, and every step I took echoed louder than it should have. At the far end of the hall, a nurse walked slowly, her clipboard tucked against her chest. She gave me a polite nod before slipping into a patient's room. I watched her go, but my eyes kept drifting back toward the room where the new patient lay. Even from outside, there was something about that room. The blinds on the small window were half drawn, and a faint glow from the monitors pulsed like a heartbeat. I knew I would have to face him again, but part of me hesitated. Something in my gut told me that the longer I stayed away, the safer I would be. Doctors are not supposed to think like that. We are trained to confront, to assess, to treat. Fear is for patients and their families, not for us. And yet, in that moment, I found myself wishing I could turn away, go back to my office, and pretend he wasn't there. But I didn't. Instead, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The man was awake. His eyes were open, staring at the ceiling. The monitors showed stable vitals, heart rate steady, oxygen levels normal. On the surface, he could have been any other patient recovering from a seizure. But there was nothing ordinary about the way he turned his head as I entered, his gaze locking onto mine as though he had been waiting. "Doctor," he said softly. His voice was raspy, but steady. "You came back." I swallowed hard. "Yes," I replied, keeping my tone professional. "I need to ask you a few questions, if you're feeling up to it." He smiled faintly, and for a moment, I thought he might refuse. "Instead," he said, "ask. But I already know what you want to hear." The words unsettled me more than I cared to admit. Still, I proceeded with the routine questions. Name, age, medical history. He answered each one calmly, though at times he spoke in a way that made me feel as though he were reciting lines from a script rather than recalling his own life. And then came the moment that truly unnerved me. I asked him what he remembered before the seizure. Patients often describe dizziness, strange sensations, or visual disturbances. But he paused, eyes narrowing as though weighing his words. "I remember the room," he whispered. "What room?" I asked. He turned his head slightly toward me, and for the first time, his expression shifted into something that chilled me to the bone. His lips curved in a faint, almost childlike smile. "This one," he said. "I remember you standing here, just like now." My pen slipped in my hand. "That's not possible," I said quickly. "This is your first time here." He shook his head, ever so slightly. "No, I've been here before. Many times. You were always here too." The words hung in the air like smoke. For a moment I couldn't breathe. I wanted to dismiss it, to chalk it up to confusion or delirium. But the calm certainty in his voice was unlike anything I had ever heard from a post-seizure patient. And then the monitors beeped. A sharp, sudden alarm. His heart rate spiked, his breathing quickened, and his eyes rolled back. He began to convulse violently, his body jerking against the bedrails. I shouted for the nurses. Within seconds, 2 of them rushed in, working with practiced efficiency to restrain him and adjust the IV. We stabilized him, the seizure passing as quickly as it had come. But even as his body went still, his lips moved, forming words too faint for the others to hear. Only I caught them. He whispered my name again. And this time, he laughed. There is a moment every doctor remembers with certain patients, a moment that sets them apart from the rest. Sometimes it is a small detail, like a look in their eyes or a sentence that lingers long after the conversation is over. With this patient, that moment happened almost immediately, and it branded itself into my memory with the permanence of a scar. After the seizure episode in the ward, I ordered a full battery of tests: MRI, CT scan, and a 24-hour EEG monitoring. I wanted science, data, and numbers to drown out the unease gnawing at my chest. If I could reduce him to charts and graphs, perhaps I could quiet the voice in my head whispering that something was wrong. Wrong in a way no machine could capture. The nurses wheeled him into the imaging suite the following morning. I followed, clipboard in hand, pretending to be calm. The corridor smelled faintly of disinfectant and metal, a familiar odor I had long since stopped noticing, except that day when it felt heavier, sharper, almost nauseating. He lay on the gurney, eyes half closed, lips twitching as though he were whispering to himself. I thought he was praying, but as I leaned closer, I realized he was repeating words under his breath. Not prayers, not fragments of memory, but names of my colleagues. At first I thought I had misheard, but then, clear as day, he murmured the name of one of the night nurses, then another doctor, each name spoken with deliberate precision. People he had never met. "Stop," I said sharply, perhaps more harshly than I intended. His eyes flicked open, and for a second, I swore they looked darker than before, deep pools of shadow that swallowed the fluorescent light. "Why should I stop?" he whispered. "They are already here." The hairs on the back of my neck rose. I motioned for the technician to begin the scan, needing desperately to focus on something clinical. The machine hummed to life, swallowing the patient into its circular maw. I stared at the monitors, watching as the images of his brain began to appear. At first, everything looked normal. No tumors, no lesions, no signs of stroke or trauma. A perfectly healthy brain. Too healthy. For someone who had seized as violently as he had, I expected some trace, some clue. But there was nothing. Then came the EG. I had read thousands of them in my career. Spikes, waves, rhythms. They were a language I knew by heart. But this one was different. The patterns were wrong. Not in the usual sense of irregular brain activity, but wrong in a way that defied categorization. They were too organized, too deliberate, almost rhythmic, as if they were not random electrical storms, but messages. I leaned closer to the screen, frowning. The waves rose and fell with uncanny precision, forming shapes that seemed almost symmetrical. My rational mind told me it was coincidence, that I was tired, that my imagination was playing tricks on me. But another part of me, a part I had never listened to before, whispered a different truth. It looked like language. "Do you see it too?" The voice came from behind me. I nearly jumped, spinning around. It was him, the patient, still strapped to the EG leads, staring at me with a faint smile. "You shouldn't be awake," I muttered, my voice harsher than I intended. "The sedative." "It doesn't work on me," he said softly. "Not anymore." My mouth went dry. He tilted his head, the smile never leaving his lips. "You stare at the lines, but you don't hear them." "They're speaking, doctor. They've been speaking all along." I forced myself to look away, back at the monitor. The waves pulsed, peaked, and dipped, and for a horrifying moment, I almost believed him. Almost. "This isn't possible," I whispered to myself. He chuckled, the sound low and unsettling. "That's what you keep saying. But you'll see. Soon, you won't be able to deny it." Before I could respond, the monitor spiked violently. The lines shot upward in chaotic bursts, alarms blaring. The patient convulsed again, his body jerking against the restraints. Nurses rushed in, their voices overlapping as they worked to stabilize him. I stood frozen, watching the screen. The spikes didn't look random. They looked like words. And in that moment, as the patient arched his back and screamed, I thought I heard it. A whisper, faint, buried under the noise of the alarms, but unmistakable. My name. In medicine, there is comfort in routine. We chart vitals, prescribe medications, analyze lab results, and follow protocols. There is order to it, a system built to give us control over the uncontrollable. But with this patient, control slipped through my fingers like sand. The morning after the tests, I visited him in his room. Sunlight filtered weakly through the blinds, casting thin stripes across his pale face. He looked calm, almost peaceful, as though the night's seizure had never happened. But the moment I stepped inside, he turned his head toward me with that same faint smile. "You didn't sleep," he said. It wasn't a question. I froze. He was right. I had barely closed my eyes. my mind haunted by the patterns I had seen on the EEG, by the whisper I thought I heard. But how could he know? "I rested enough," I replied, forcing professionalism into my tone. He chuckled softly, his lips curling in amusement. "You don't have to lie to me, doctor. I saw you. Sitting in your office, staring at the papers, drinking coffee you didn't finish." A chill slid down my spine. I told myself it was a guess, a lucky guess. Any nurse could have told him I'd been in my office late. But the detail, the unfinished coffee, was too specific, too real. I cleared my throat and began the exam, checking his reflexes, his motor function, his orientation. All normal. Every test I performed only deepened the dissonance between his healthy body and the chaos I had seen in his brain waves. And then there were the episodes. At first, they were subtle. He would suddenly stop mid-sentence, his eyes fixed on something only he could see. His lips would move as if he were whispering to someone. When asked, he would shrug it off, claiming he was just listening. Listening to what? The nurses reported stranger things. One swore she saw him sitting upright in bed at 3 a.m., speaking fluently in a language she didn't recognize. Another said she caught him staring at the ceiling for nearly an hour without blinking. Still, none of it was impossible. Odd, yes. Disturbing, absolutely. But not beyond the realm of neurology. Hallucinations, delirium, postictal confusion, all possible explanations. And yet, one evening, I stood at his bedside, reviewing his chart, when I noticed something odd. His eyes were closed, his breathing steady, as if asleep. But the heart monitor showed a rhythm that didn't match rest. His pulse spiked and slowed in perfect intervals, almost like a metronome. I frowned, leaning closer to the monitor, and that's when I heard it. A faint sound. Not from the machine, from him, whispering. At first, I thought it was the usual incoherent murmuring of sleep, but as I leaned closer, my blood ran cold. He was whispering numbers. A sequence, steady and deliberate, each digit clear. And not random numbers either. They were my pager code. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. It was impossible. He had never seen my pager, never heard my code. No one outside the staff knew it. And yet, he recited it with eerie precision, as though it had been etched into his memory long before we met. I left the room quickly, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the chart. Logic screamed at me. There must be an explanation. Perhaps he overheard it, perhaps someone mentioned it, perhaps it was coincidence. But another part of me, the part I had spent my life silencing, whispered a darker possibility. That night, I couldn't concentrate on anything else. I sat in my office, the lamp casting long shadows across the desk, replaying every detail in my head, his smile, his words, the whispers, the numbers. And then I noticed something else. The EEG printouts. I had left them scattered across my desk. I picked one up, tracing the jagged lines with my finger. The patterns were still there, unnerving in their symmetry. But as I shifted the paper under the light, I froze. The peaks and valleys seemed to form shapes, letters, and if I aligned the pages side by side, they spelled something. It was faint, broken, like a puzzle missing pieces. But the word was unmistakable. My name. I dropped the papers, my chest tightening. Sweat gathered at the back of my neck. It was impossible. Machines don't write names. Brains don't spell words. And yet, there it was. I wanted to tell myself it was fatigue, my tired mind twisting patterns into meaning where none existed. But when I closed my eyes, I could still see it. Sharp, undeniable. The patient was not just sick. He was aware of me in a way no patient ever should be. And worse, I was beginning to realize something I dared not admit out loud. Whatever was happening to him was not contained within his mind. It was spilling into mine. In neurology, the brain is both the greatest map and the greatest mystery. Every patient's scan, every waveform, every lab result is supposed to bring us closer to understanding. But with him, the deeper I looked, the less sense it made. The test results arrived in batches over the following days. Each one should have given me clarity, but instead, they tangled me in contradictions that mocked every principle of medicine I had ever learned. The MRI was pristine. A brain so perfectly symmetrical, so structurally sound, it looked more like a model than a living organ. No lesions, no tumors, no vascular anomalies. For a man who had just endured a prolonged seizure, it was astonishing. Normally, I would expect at least some trace of damage, swelling, scarring, subtle hints of trauma, but his brain was flawless. The CT scan echoed the same story. Normal, too normal. And yet, the EEG, I couldn't stop staring at it. Every time I reviewed the tracings, I saw patterns where there should have been chaos. They weren't the jagged bursts of epilepsy, nor the slowed rhythms of encephalopathy. They were structured, intentional, almost as if someone or something was trying to write. I showed the scans to a colleague, masking my unease behind casual curiosity. He squinted at the tracings, then shrugged. "Artifact," he said dismissively. "Machine picked up interference, probably static or movement. You know how it is." I nodded, forcing a smile. But inside, dread coiled tighter. I knew artifact when I saw it. This wasn't artifact. Still, I wanted to believe him. Until the blood work came back. At first glance, it was normal. Electrolytes balanced. No signs of infection, kidney and liver function intact. But buried in the details were anomalies that made no sense. The patient's cortisol levels were abnormally high, as though he had been under extreme, prolonged stress. His neurotransmitter assays, which we sometimes run in rare seizure cases, showed fluctuations inconsistent with any known disorder. Dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine, spiking and plummeting in ways no medication or disease could explain. It was as if his brain chemistry was being manipulated by an external hand. I remember sitting at my desk, papers spread before me, the clock ticking relentlessly on the wall. Every result screamed contradiction. A perfectly healthy brain housing impossible activity. A body at rest producing the chemistry of terror. A man both fragile and indestructible at once. The nurses were growing restless too. They reported equipment failures in his room. Monitors freezing, alarms sounding without cause, IV pumps shutting off inexplicably. One nurse swore she felt the temperature drop whenever she entered, though the thermostat showed nothing unusual. Another claimed the lights flickered only when she was near his bed. I wanted to dismiss it all as coincidence. Hospitals are full of failing machines and tired minds. But the accumulation of details weighed heavily on me. And then came the incident that shattered my last defense of rationality. I was reviewing his chart at the nurse's station when the intercom buzzed. A nurse's panicked voice called my name. I sprinted down the corridor, my shoes pounding against the linoleum, and burst into his room. He was seizing again. Or at least, that's what I thought. His body jerked violently, his limbs thrashing against the restraints. His eyes rolled upward, his mouth twisted in guttural sounds. The monitor alarms screamed, showing erratic heart rhythms, oxygen levels dropping. We moved quickly. 2 nurses holding him down, another preparing medication. I grabbed the syringe, ready to administer the sedative, and then everything stopped. Not just him. Everything. The monitors froze mid-alarm. The IV pump stilled. Even the fluorescent lights above seemed to dim, holding their glow in unnatural suspension. The nurses froze too, their eyes wide with terror. For a fraction of a second, it felt as though time itself had paused. And in that frozen silence, his head snapped toward me. His eyes locked onto mine. He spoke my name. Clear, calm, deliberate. And then he smiled. Before I could react, the world lurched back into motion. The monitors resumed their frantic beeping. The lights hummed. The nurses shouted. The patient convulsed again, as though nothing had happened. But I knew it had. I stood paralyzed, the syringe trembling in my hand, sweat dripping down my back. The nurses didn't mention the pause. Perhaps they hadn't felt it the way I had. Perhaps it had only been me. But I knew. Something had happened in that room. Something beyond seizures, beyond medicine, beyond explanation. I administered the sedative with a shaking hand, watching as his body gradually stilled. His breathing slowed, his eyes closed. But just before he slipped into unconsciousness, his lips moved one last time. "You can't fix this," he whispered. And I realized, with a horror I could not admit to anyone, that he was right. Hospitals at night have a rhythm of their own. During the day, the wards hum with chatter, footsteps, and the shuffle of endless charts. But once night falls, a stillness takes over, a silence broken only by the distant ring of telephones, the hiss of oxygen, and the muted wheels of a nurse's cart. It was during one of those nights that everything shifted again. I couldn't sleep. I rarely did when a case gnawed at me, and this one was consuming me whole. I lingered long after my shift, pacing the corridors, my coat draped loosely over my shoulders. The rational part of me told me to go home, get rest, recharge. But some instinct kept me rooted to the ICU, unable to leave him unattended. His room was dark except for the faint glow of the monitors. The machines pulsed their rhythm, steady, calm. His body lay still, sedated, but I had learned better than to trust appearances. I pulled up a chair and sat beside him, the way one might sit vigil at a bedside. For a time, nothing happened. I listened to the mechanical sigh of the ventilator, the soft drip of IV fluids. My eyes grew heavy, my mind drifting, and then he spoke. At first, I thought it was a dream. A murmur slipped from his lips, quiet and deliberate. "Doctor." I jolted upright, my pulse quickening. His eyes were closed, yet his mouth formed words with chilling precision. "You stayed." I leaned closer, struggling to steady my voice. "You're awake." His lips curled into the faintest trace of a smile. "Wake, as much as one can be." His voice was soft but clear, echoing strangely in the dim room. It didn't carry the groggy slur of sedation. It was purposeful. "What do you mean?" I asked cautiously. "You watch the body. You test the brain. But you do not see what lies between." My scalp prickled. Between what? His eyelids flickered but did not open. Between thought and flesh. Between memory and silence. "That is where I am." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "You're having seizures. That's what's happening to you. Your brain is misfiring." His voice carried a low chuckle, humorless and cold. "Is that what you tell yourself to sleep at night? That the brain explains it all?" My hands curled tightly in my lap. For a moment, I considered leaving the room, calling this delirium a byproduct of sedatives. But something anchored me to that chair. "You said my name," I pressed. "During your last episode." "How did you know me?" He paused. The silence stretched until I thought he wouldn't answer. And then, "I know many things," he said slowly. "I see them when your world goes still. When the machines stop. When the clocks hold their breath. That is when I can look." "Look where?" I whispered. "Into you. Into all of you." The air felt suddenly heavy, pressing down on me. My heart raced, pounding in my ears. "What do you see?" His lips moved carefully, as if savoring the words. "Fear, regret. The night you stayed too long in the OR, convincing yourself you could save her." The silence after the monitors went flat. "You don't speak of it, but I see it." My blood ran cold. He couldn't know that. Nobody could. It was buried, sealed inside me like a wound I never let heal. I stood abruptly, my chair scraping against the floor. My instinct was to deny it, to walk out, to convince myself it was nonsense. But before I could take a step, his voice cut through the dark again. "Don't leave." "Not yet. You asked questions. I will answer them." I froze. Against every instinct, I sank back into the chair. "Why are you here?" I demanded, though my voice shook. "To show you," he replied. "To remind you that there are places your science does not reach. You call them seizures, episodes, anomalies, but they are doors. And sometimes doors swing both ways." I shivered, gripping the armrest until my knuckles whitened. "You expect me to believe this? That you're what? Possessed?" His smile widened faintly, though his eyes never opened. Possession is a simple word for small minds. I am only crossing. That is all. Crossing from where? He didn't answer immediately. His breathing slowed, as though he were slipping into sleep. Then, just as I thought the moment had passed, he whispered, "From where you'll follow." The words slithered into my chest like ice water. I wanted to demand clarity, to shake him awake, but my voice failed me. Instead, silence reclaimed the room. His lips stilled. His body relaxed once more, sinking into the rhythm of the machines. I sat there long after, my mind spiraling, replaying every syllable. Was it possible he had overheard something, caught fragments of conversation, pieced together guesses, or was I staring into a truth too vast to accept? The night stretched endlessly. Nurses came and went, checking vitals, adjusting drips. None of them reported hearing him speak. None noticed anything unusual. And so, by morning, I was left with nothing but my own terror and the haunting echo of his voice. But deep down, I knew one thing with certainty. He wasn't delirious, he knew me. And worse, he knew the places I had buried within myself. The hospital runs on routine. Morning rounds, lab reports, updates, discharges, cycles of predictability that anchor us. But when I walked into his room on the 7th day, that sense of routine collapsed. He was awake. Not just awake, but alert. His eyes were open, fixed on the ceiling, sharp and steady. For the first time, he wasn't thrashing, seizing, or whispering in riddles. He was simply present. I felt my chest tighten as his gaze shifted and locked onto mine. "You came," he said softly. My throat tightened. "Yes, you're awake. How do you feel?" Like a guest who has stayed too long. His lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "But I won't be here much longer." The nurse on duty shifted uncomfortably, glancing at me for reassurance. I gave her a subtle nod and dismissed her from the room. When the door clicked shut, he spoke again. "They don't need to hear this. Only you." I swallowed. "Why me?" "Because you already carry the weight. You already see the cracks." I pulled up the chair and sat. My pen trembled against the chart. "What cracks?" "In your world. In your science. In your belief that every mystery is only data waiting to be explained. But you know better, don't you? You've seen the moments when medicine fails, when you stand helpless as life slips away." My hands went cold. "That doesn't mean what you're implying. Death is part of life. It doesn't prove anything supernatural." He chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "And yet, you stayed that night. Remember, after everyone else left the OR, you stayed beside her body, whispering apologies, as if she could hear. You already believe more than you admit." The air left my lungs in a rush. My mind screamed for logic, for defense, but my chest throbbed with guilt too old and too raw. "Stop," I whispered. He ignored me. His voice grew stronger, more deliberate. "You want proof? Listen." He closed his eyes, and then he began to speak. At first, I thought he was rambling, listing times, names, events. But as he went on, my blood chilled. He described things that hadn't happened yet. At 3:17 p.m., the power would flicker on the 3rd floor. A nurse would drop a tray in surprise. At 4:02 p.m., a man in the waiting room would collapse, clutching his chest. At 5:41 p.m., the fire alarm would sound, though there would be no fire. I leaned back, shaking my head. "You can't know these things." He opened his eyes, pinning me with a gaze that was both exhausted and endless. "I already do." I left the room shaken, clinging to rationality. Predictions meant nothing until tested. Coincidence, guesswork, that was all it had to be. But then, at 3:17, the lights flickered. I heard the metallic clatter of a dropped tray. At 4:02, the overhead speaker called a code to the waiting room. A man lay collapsed, gasping for air. At 5041, the alarm blared, shrill and panicked, sending staff scrambling until the system confirmed no fire. Each event struck me like a hammer, eroding my defenses. This wasn't coincidence. He had known. Somehow, impossibly, he had known. When I returned to his room, he was waiting, his face pale but triumphant. "Do you see now?" he whispered. I couldn't answer. My voice, my reason, my certainty, all had been stripped away. "You think I am sick," he said. "But I am only a fracture, a tear in the fabric of what you call reality. And through me, the other side peers back." I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. The other side of what? His lips parted, and for a heartbeat, I thought he would tell me. But then his chest convulsed violently. The monitors shrieked in alarm. Nurses rushed in, pushing me aside. His body arched, his face contorted in agony. "Code Blue!" someone shouted. I joined the chaos, compressing his chest, shouting orders, fighting to drag him back. We worked furiously, minutes stretching into eternities. But even as I pressed down on his sternum, even as adrenaline surged into his veins, his eyes found mine, and with the faintest breath, he whispered, "It's too late." The flatline followed. The room fell silent. We called the time of death. And just like that, he was gone. But the silence that followed was heavier than death, because in my heart, I knew he hadn't been wrong. It has been years since that night, yet the memory lingers, haunting me with a persistence I cannot escape. I told myself, at first, that it was coincidence, that a dying man had guessed at patterns and luck had made him seem prophetic. I buried the files deep in storage, sealed the EG reports, and left his name off every teaching case. But the truth never stayed buried. Sometimes, in the quiet hours of the night, I hear the echoes of the monitors in my dreams. Sometimes the hospital lights flicker, and I remember his warnings. Sometimes a patient whispers my name, and I freeze, waiting for a smile that should not be possible. I am a neurologist. My duty is to study the brain, to chart its mysteries with science and discipline. But no textbook prepared me for him. No test could contain what he was. To this day, I cannot explain it. I can only tell you that when I close my eyes, I still see him, lying in that bed, staring at me with impossible knowledge. And sometimes, in the silence between heartbeats, I think I hear his voice again. "You'll follow?" And I wonder if he was right.
Subscribe for more videos.